When I walk into evangelical churches, I start shaking. I feel
Oh my gosh.
nauseous.
Wow.
It's traumatic for me. I was like casual Catholic, couldn't ask for forgiveness of my sins on my own. I had to always have someone as a go-between between me and God. This is why I have such a problem with organized religion, which is what we're going to get into. I believe that God resides in absolute truth in black and white, but we on earth are here contending with the gray.
Hey guys, it's Lizzie. I am so excited. Today we have a special guest on my channel. This is Brenda.
Hi everyone, it's God is Gray.
For everyone watching, I know you said this in your video. Please be so kind and loving and charitable in the comments. If you do want her to have a more positive view of Catholicism, it's important to be Christ-like in how you're talking about her in the comments. So we would both really, really appreciate that. What kind of church do you identify with? Like what Protestant denomination? And do you currently go to a physical church to worship? Or is it more just you on your own and with other Christians?
Really good question. I was like casual Catholic, as I've told you, which means that I did not have the knowledge that you do on the faith. So I didn't like really research it and then choose to abandon it. It was just like, it felt boring and stagnant, and my priest in New Jersey never went into like description. He would just like read a verse, and then I wanted to know so much more. So when I stepped into what is called a non-denominational church, which I have to push back against as well, because to me, that's evangelical is a denomination. It's
absolutely. Thank you for saying this. Yeah, I totally agree.
I'm like, guys, stop, because and it was, I don't know, it's kind of like elitist, because they're basically saying like, oh, we're not like the old school, like we're not going to be repressive about our ideas, we're non-denominational, we're accepting of everybody. And it's like, no, you're not, dude. So it was the denomination like of evangelicalism. I don't know if that terminology is accurate.
You grew up as a Catholic? Can you explain?
Yeah, I grew up as a Catholic. Yeah, I grew up as a Catholic until I was 12. Always resonated deeply with Jesus, would be at my bedside praying for wars to end and for my family. And my dad was my first theology teacher, and I love him so much for it, and he did a beautiful job. He definitely accidentally gave me some toxic messages that I've worked through as an adult, but he was, he really did a beautiful job and was doing his best to impart the wisdom that he had been given. And we had beautiful conversations, like just going through the Bible together. They're my fondest memories. So anyway, being a Catholic church, I felt like I wasn't receiving any true knowledge or wisdom from it. It was just the act of going. And my friend invited me to this born again, non-denominational church, which was evangelical. And I was excited because I did love God, but I also was a nerd in high school. I hadn't been kissed, and there were going to be like so many cute boys there. And I was 12 years old, like coming into puberty, and I just wanted fresh meat basically and some God on the side. I was like, yeah, whatever. But I came in and I was enthralled. And as much as I would admit that I do have a lot of anger towards evangelicalism and my experiences, especially around sexuality, I do have to say that the bigger picture and the lessons that I was learning and the way they encouraged me to actually read the Bible and understand it on my own, I felt very empowered by it. Like in Catholicism, the way it was presented to me, I like couldn't ask for forgiveness of my sins on my own. I had to always have someone as a go-between between me and God. And in this evangelical church, they got rid of that. And they were like, you have the Holy Spirit in yourself. You have this power to speak to God on your own. And I found that so amazing. And it was the first time I ever actually opened the Bible in my 12 years of life on my own with any sort of confidence that I could actually understand it. I thought it was like, and I used to feel the same way about like Shakespearean plays. I'm like, this is over my head. And just like, no, you just sit down and read it. You can actually understand it. So those were the beautiful elements of evangelicalism. But now I'm forgetting the original question. Okay, yeah, where do I go now? Because of how problematic and painful the evangelical church has been for me in the past, it is very hard for me to walk into churches and feel safe. I interview this wonderful author named Jamie Lee Finch, and she talks a lot about embodiment and how in Christianity and some doctrines that we've been given, we feel like our flesh is evil and it's our enemy, and our spirit is elevated above all else. And the embodiment practice, or aligning your spirituality and your sexuality, is all about coming back into your body, not vilifying your body anymore, not celebrating it, not leaning into every desire that you have, but actually listening to what your body is saying and honoring that this is the vessel that God gave you to move through life. So I have to acknowledge in my body, when I walk into evangelical churches, I start shaking. I feel nauseous.
Wow.
Yeah. And it still happen. It would happen tomorrow. And it's crazy because I thought if I dove more into this space of talking so openly about it, that I would be less scared of my fellow Christians, but my body just screams when I'm in those environments. So that said, I was visiting church after church after church for week after week after week, probably about a year ago. And it was just really hard for me to stay in those environments because I also knew they weren't believing doctrinally the way that I believe now. So I knew that I would hear purity messages, and I did. I heard purity messages, I heard anti-LGBTQ doctrine, and, you know, I just shrivel up inside and run away from those spaces now. And I don't want to. I want to walk in with like more power and confidence. But I'm just listening to my body, and it's traumatic for me. That said, a lot of people keep writing me and they're like, guess what? You're a Quaker. Guess what? You're Episcopalian. So I have actually been learning more about those two denominations. And I'm like, oh, these resonate. So I'm just now thinking of starting to maybe step into one of those two environments and see if that's what resonates with where I'm at now.
Yeah. So what specifically about purity culture was so toxic for you and so harmful? Like, how do you define purity culture?
I think the quickest way to define purity culture is that it separates the spirit from the body. And I know that was never the intention. The intention of church leaders in my life experience was so pure. And I even asked my mom this at a point, because I did the whole chastity ceremony. I actually instigated and planned it.
What is a chastity ceremony? I've never heard of that.
You haven't?
No. My church wasn't like that growing up.
Oh, wow. Okay. This is like a huge phenomena it began in the 1980s. It really started popping up with the True Love Waits movement. There was a big to-do about it. Joshua Harris comes out with his book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And that's the reason, for example, that Bethany and Kristen from Girl Defined saved the first kiss for marriage, because Joshua Harris took purity culture and took it to the next level, which is like, you're not only saving sex for marriage, you're saving everything, including emotional responses to the person that you're engaging with. Like, you need to save everything for your partner, which was so traumatizing that actually a hashtag started on Twitter called I Survived I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And Joshua Harris ended up taking that book out of print and denouncing the whole thing. Yeah. So it's been big and heavy. And if you read a book like Linda K. Klein's Pure, is something I'm always promoting. She did 12 years of research on purity doctrine and the result that it had on people. And now in psychology, they're starting to diagnose what they're calling religious trauma syndrome. And it's not the same as PTSD, but it mirrors some of the same symptoms that PTSD has. So the church had, like, to go back to the original point, I asked my mom when I was doing this chastity ceremony, which was when you publicly pledge your virginity in front of, you know, a lot of people. A lot of times your dad is there and he signs the contract with you.
What?
Yes.
The contract?
Yes. And then you put a ring on your finger to symbolize your purity. And the concept of your dad signing that with you and being there with you is because you are God's, and, you know, your father is that representation, your heavenly father, your earthly father. And then one day your father will give you over to your husband. So it's like this like chain of command. which really translate to who is owning your body at different points in your life. And I know that might sound extreme, but if you really look at the way it translates, like you have a pure message of like your father is going to protect you until marriage and he's going, you know, whatever. It's like, that sounds beautiful, but really the way it translates to so many people is that they didn't have ownership over their own body, that they weren't allowed to express how they actually felt about something. And the results of this, you know, in Linda K. Klein's book, you can see it resulted in erectile dysfunction for men, vaginismus for women, because your body, again, will have physical responses to your emotional feelings. So married couples were getting married and finding that they had all of this sexual strife and problems because they hadn't been given any tools to understanding what sex really is.
That's wild.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we can go way, way more deeply into it, but that is purity culture. And that's why I think you can sum it up with separation. Purity culture to me is these supposedly beautiful ideas. My mom told me she allowed me to do this ceremony and she allowed me to put a ring on my finger because she had experienced sexual trauma in her own life. She regretted a lot of her sexual choices. And she was like, oh, this is so exciting. She's going to save herself from all the trauma that I went through. And I think a lot of the generation before us really saw it that way, as this invitation for us to actually live a healthier sexual ethic. Like in my video, we got into the sexual revolution in that conversation. Like my mom is a product of that, and that did hurt her. Like hookup culture does hurt. And so this was the opposite, and she thought it was a positive thing.
One thing related to this that I like about Catholicism that is a distinction is instead of saying staying a virgin or being a virgin, we say being celibate. So instead of focusing on you become impure if you have sex out of marriage, it's kind of a thing in the moment where you can choose to be celibate, but we don't view it as like you're dirty or permanently you lose some kind of purity if you did have sex in the past. Does that make sense? So it's like talking about current celibacy rather than this is wounded. And I think that as well, I've gotten messages from people who have grown up Christian, from my subscribers, who were raped, and they said my purity is gone permanently because you had non-consensual sex. And that's just insane that an ideology can lead for women to feel like that. It's so, so sad.
You're really warming me up to Catholicism.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I really appreciate that sexual ethic. And, you know, so many people now are coming out and saying virginity is a social construct. We need to stop using the term virgin. And I completely agree, because it is so damaging to the psyche to be categorized as what is pure. The definition of pure in purity culture is a person that never had penetrative sex. And that's not, first of all, what purity is. Like purity of mind, body, soul, and spirit is so much deeper than whether or not a person has done a sexual activity. Like stop. Like I've also said too, that the evangelical church has put that they've made an idol out of sexual purity. And I completely believe it. They worship it. They say, because I'm not a virgin, because I'm not married, I'm not a Christian. I'm like, my belief in Jesus and my engagement in that relationship has nothing to do, like the two are related in that it really matters how you honor your body and your sexuality with your spiritual practice. But it's not as definitive as this defines you as a Christian and this immediately takes you out of the category of Christianity. That's ignorant and ridiculous. So you saying that celibacy is the word and that you're not impure and that you're not defiled irrevocably is beautiful and far, far, far more accurate of what sex actually is.
I'm curious though, was there a specific denomination of the evangelical church you were a part of that had all these purity messages?
No, I think, I really don't know how far it reaches, because I've talked to a lot of people from a lot of different denominations, like Southern Baptist, for example. And then this non-denominational label is something that I don't even know the history of who created that.
I think it's Baptist. It comes from more Baptist churches. So that's what I would guess, Southern Baptist.
Right. Because from the church that I was in, they presented that term as like, it's better, it's newer, it's something that is like moving appropriately with the times and is more inclusive. Like we're non-denominational, we accept everybody. And, of course that's not true. But yeah, so I'm not sure how expansive that message was, but I'm pretty sure it crosses many different Protestant denominations. And I would absolutely categorize evangelicalism and non-denominational as Protestant in general. Like,
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
that's the umbrella.
Yeah. And for anyone who's new to my channel, I grew up in a church called Churches of Christ, and we didn't have that type of purity culture as part of our church. So it's so eye-opening hearing this. I understand why you feel scarred by the whole experience. Absolutely.
Yeah, it is scarring. Yeah. I was so fragmented. The story that I keep telling is that I got married. I didn't make it fully to the altar because, unlike you, with your ethic about your sexuality and why you're waiting for marriage, I didn't know why I was doing it. I just knew that supposedly God would cry if I did it, that he would be upset with me if I did it. And guess what? If you're an intellectual person, that is not going to hold weight for a very long time because it doesn't make sense. It's not enough to abstain from such a strong desire as sex. So I ended up talking myself out of it. I attempted to have a one-night stand just to get rid of my virginity. That's what I was calling it. And me and this guy ended up pursuing me really hard. He found out that I had been a virgin before, and I push back against that word now. I call it sexual debut. But yeah, so we got married really because I felt so incredibly guilty for having had sex with him that I thought his pursuit of me, him wanting to be with me, was God giving me an opportunity to redeem my sin. I really believed that if I married him, then I would be forgiven and I wouldn't be living in this sexual sin anymore. So that's a terrible reason to get married if you haven't already figured that out. And God bless us, we were 23 and 24 years old. Like I held no animosity towards him whatsoever. I've forgiven myself for all of these things as well. And I don't mean the sex part. I mean forgiving myself for, just being so warped in my head about what this was all about and dragging this man into a marriage. But after we were married for like almost 2 years, he admitted that he was cheating on me while we were dating. And yeah.
Before you even got married.
Before we got married. And then his main thing he kept saying was like, but I was a faithful husband. And I was like, I've only had sex with you. And I'm the kind of girl that sex has been a huge motivator in my life. I am a very sexually driven person, and that is something that I have to manage and maintain properly in my life. When I found out that he had slept with the number of people he slept with before we got married, and then he added to that number after we were married, and I'd only been with one person, I felt so robbed and cheated. And I was like, I want a sexual journey of my own, and I know God won't allow me to do it, but like, this is messed up. Now, I was just, my whole world crumbled. And my world also crumbled because in purity culture, I was told that if you save yourself for marriage, you'll live happily ever after. And it wasn't said that literally, but it really was. That was the message. Like, if you are pure, if you're a good girl, if you do everything right, you will have a great marriage. God will bless you. You'll have wonderful sex within that marriage, and you guys will ride off in the sunset together. I heard that narrative so many times I couldn't even tell you. So when you don't have that happily ever after, you will have a crisis in your mind. And a lot of people in purity culture experience that. Like, we were not given this God-given promise of this perfect life didn't come through, So anyway, I then swung to the other side and I became like really promiscuous, and I just wanted to explore sexuality and understand it. And I did that, and I have a lot to say about that. But in short, it really led to me being in one situation where someone was having like kind of violent sex with me. It wasn't non-consensual. It wasn't an assault, nothing like that. Like, I have nothing bad to say about this person, but I was so compartmentalized and so disconnected from my sexuality because I believed God would hate me for doing what I was doing. and I was telling God, you stay out of the bedroom while I do this sinful thing and you can come back in when it's over, that, you know, in your and I video, you talked about how you even pray when you're kissing your boyfriend because you want to make sure God is like honored in that experience and that you are doing right by him. And that is really the way to be, because if I had been praying, if I had allowed God into those experiences with me, if my sexuality and spirituality were aligned, I would have known that even if I was supposedly sinning, quote unquote, that I deserve to not be hurt, that I deserve to not be in a violent situation. But instead, I hovered over my body, and it's the only time I've had an out-of-body experience where I felt like I was looking at the situation. And I was saying to myself, well, this is what you deserve. You're being a bad girl. You're sinning. God's not going to protect you. And it's so tragic and terrible. And I've heard this story from other women, because it's like, no, you don't deserve your body to be hurt under any circumstance ever. And you don't need God to protect you from that situation. You need to use your voice. You need to like speak up. And in that situation particularly, this was a good guy. I could have actually said to him, that doesn't feel good. You're hurting me. I don't want to have sex with you like this. But I hadn't given like information, permission. No, like I didn't have a sexual ethic that made any sense. So sorry, that's the longest answer in the world, but it's like, but I think it's that compartmentalization that kills so many of us. We need to be aligned.
That's so interesting, because the church I grew up in had nothing like that at all. Obviously, they taught that sex is in marriage, but we didn't have any type of purity culture or anything. And obviously Catholicism doesn't either. So that's like horrifying, because I watched a lot of your videos talking about purity culture, and my understanding of it is that it's toxic, but I didn't know it was that toxic.
It's really, it's really bad.
And it harmed you so much. It has harmed so many people.
Millions. So, yeah.
And then it hurts the marriage as well. So it's destroying marriages as well. So.
Well, yeah, that's why, you know, it's difficult. I was actually researching Nate and Sutton's channel. Do you know that married couple? They're doing really well on YouTube. And I was watching them and I'm just like, these look like the nicest people. They have a great marriage. They're imparting like really beautiful concepts, but they obviously are products of purity culture, and they still hang their hat on that and believe in it. And it's like, they're the 1%, or I'll be generous and say 10% of people that it actually works for. It's like you just find your partner in church and you just fall massively in love and you have so much sexual chemistry, and then you get married and it works out beautifully, and like you do ride off into the sunset together. And it's like, I can't fault them for having that genuine experience and imparting to the world like, hey, this totally works. But I would beg them, and I will make a video about this, to actually consider it more deeply, because they are a rarity. They're not the commonality. And it was represented as the opposite to all of us. Fear around sexuality versus giving sexual ethic to people, which is why you're softening me up to the sexual ethic of Catholicism, because I'm like, sounds like you guys are talking about in a way that actually is talking about honoring the spirit and the body, not just imparting fear to people to control them.
And something else is that everyone has inherent worth and inherent purity given by God. And so it's impossible for a human to strip away that worth that God is in every person. I recently read this book by Saint Teresa of Avila called The Interior Castle, and she describes every single human as having this light so bright in their soul, just shining forever, permanently, and that's God in everyone. And so you can't strip away that worth from any human being. And I think that modesty culture was something that was kind of toxic in my church growing up, where they taught that women are causing males to sin, and it's like your fault for causing males to sin. And I was actually talking about this with my boyfriend last night, where there's some people who literally believe that women lose their sense of respect when they dress immodestly. Like you know what I mean? Like men are going to view them as less worthy or less respectable because of how they dress. And it's like, absolutely not. That person is you should inherently respect them. They have inherent value because God is living in them. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, I appreciate you bringing that up, because this is why I have such a problem with organized religion, which is what we're going to get into, because there can be so much good and so much evil in the same place, under the same steeple. And this is a perfect example. I'm so glad you have the purity ethic or like aspect completely not in there, because that's terrible. But the modesty, I actually made a video on modesty, and I pulled clips from Catholics that were talking about it. And those are almost direct quotes that you just said, that if a woman is dressed in a certain way and she causes a man to stumble, that sin will be on her head because she caused it. And that, I mean, that's rape culture in a nutshell. Like, it doesn't get...
Exactly.
Yeah. So that is a problem. And I also was on Twitter recently, and a priest had talked about how a woman in the congregation like came into church and she was wearing something immodest, and it was so distracting, and she, like, someone had to ask her to cover up, or ask her to meet, I think cover up, but she may have ultimately left.
Probably. And, you would leave after someone told you to cover up. Like, you wouldn't want to come back to mass after that.
Well, that's the thing that's so despicable to me. I'm just like, what? Like, imagine that girl could have been anybody. That girl could have been someone with the purest heart walking into the church seeking something. She didn't know you guys had this stupid like rule based on your own insecurities, based on your own capability of like being able to sin or do something wrong to her. You misplaced that. You put that on her and chased her away forever. I'm sure, I mean, I hope she would. I was going to say, I hope she'd come back to a church, but I'm telling you, I'm afraid of churches. So I don't know. I hope she comes to the God is Grey YouTube channel or the Lizzie Answers YouTube channel, because church, I'm sure, demolished her in that moment. And that is tragedy and not reflective of Jesus at all. I mean, he would never.
Yeah, and in the Bible, a lot of the Bible verses about dressing modestly have to do with really rich women walking into church. It'd be like today if a woman came in with like designer clothes and everything. That's what it was talking about, more of a mindset than dress. And I actually get attacked a lot for how I dress. People think I dress super immodestly because of my Instagram and stuff. And it's like, I live in California, and how we dress in California is different than how you dress in Minnesota or in Pennsylvania. Like, modesty is so relativistic in different countries. Like, in some countries in Africa, having your breast exposed is like totally normal and modest. And here that wouldn't be. So it's so difficult. Like, I never judge how women dress in basically any context, just because modesty is different depending on culture. And in the US, there's dozens of cultures. So
yeah, and a thought that just came to me is, so many people will say, you have to look at someone's heart. You should never be looking at their attire. You're looking at their heart. But if I'm having a conversation with a woman wearing a bikini, in a strange environment, like whatever, at a barbecue where everyone else is dressed perfectly, I would never presume to know her heart according to her attire. But a lot of the narrative in this modesty message that's so toxic is that you can see someone's heart reflected in their clothing. And a lot of Christian YouTubers say that again and again and again. They'll be like, if your heart is for Jesus, your clothing should reflect that. And in turn, they end up easily vilifying people that are not modestly dressed by their personal standards, because they're like, well, clearly her heart is not in the right place. Clearly she has, issues or whatever. And it's like, no, especially when I was younger, I was just dressing really haphazardly. I wasn't even thinking about it. In California,
Exactly.
like you said, it's hot. You just like walk out the door. I was never walking through the world assuming that I had to prove my heart according to what I was wearing. And that's not fair. It has nothing to do with whether or not you're a Christian. And that said, like, I think with you, like, you receive the message of abstinence and chastity in a really positive way, and you've made that a decision for yourself. That's the way I think modesty should come to people. First of all, like you said, biblically, modesty is just about not flaunting all of your stuff, which is ironic because so many people in the prosperity gospel churches are not modest. They're flaunting their private jets and their, Bethel church. Apparently they all have Maseratis. It's like, that's immodesty. That's what the Bible was actually talking about. So I don't know. I feel like I've already gone on a tangent, but but I was saying with modesty, it's like something that now I navigate, I just actually feel sexier and more beautiful when I'm exposing less. And I don't feel it's age appropriate to dress in a certain way. And if I go into a certain meeting or a situation, or I feel like my dress would distract someone while I'm talking to them, whatever, I just navigate situationally. And
Exactly.
I feel very good about that. I don't feel like less of a Christian for that.
Yeah, and for everyone watching, I'm not saying that I completely disagree with modesty. I think modesty is important in how you dress and not just not being showy, but I really do agree with modesty, but just there's a lot of toxic things spread about modesty and toxic reasons to be modest.
Yeah.
It's not about, like, modesty should primarily be about the woman and not about causing men to sin. So any modesty talk that starts like that is gonna be toxic. Okay, so the way I do my extras, I do thank you guys so much for watching. I love you so much, and I'll see you in my next video. And then I'm like, bye. So if you say bye with me, that'll be really cute.
Okay, cool.
Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I love you so much, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.
Bye.